Before the first spear was hurled, before the shields clashed and blood soaked the soil, the Roman army had already begun its assault on the mind. War, for them, started not on the battlefield, but deep within the psyche. Roman soldiers were not merely trained to fight, they were molded by fear, ritual, and unshakable superstition. Before every campaign, men would gather in silence and slit open their palms, swearing blood oaths beneath flickering torches. These vows were not just promises, they were spiritual contracts bound by the threat of divine punishment. To break them was to invite eternal damnation. In the ranks of Rome's elite, some soldiers wore death masks, grotesque, lifeless faces crafted in the image of their ancestors. These weren't decorations. They were walking specters of vengeance, terrifying both enemies and comrades alike by reminding them that the dead marched beside the living. Before each battle, Rome's priest diviners would study the flight of birds and the entrails of sacrificed animals. If the signs were wrong, the battle was delayed, confusing enemies who mistook spiritual caution for divine certainty. And then came the chants. Rhythmic, thunderous, almost inhuman, these unified war cries were not merely to rally troops, but to summon the war gods themselves. Mars, they believed, would enter their bodies through their breath and possess them with battle frenzy. But perhaps most disturbing were the mock executions. Roman generals would sometimes drag out a soldier, bound and shaking, preparing to make an example of him, only to stay the blade at the final moment. It was theater, yes, but it was deadly serious. These rituals weren't about strategy alone. They were psychological warfare turned inward, forging soldiers who feared their own shame and gods more than any enemy. Rome didn't just train warriors, it engineered believers in blood, fear, and destiny. If you're drawn to the shadows of history, where war was a ritual and fear was a weapon, drop "I'm ready" in the comments. And let the world know you've stepped into the mind of a Roman soldier. Smash the thumbs up, strike that subscribe button like a legionnaire with a gladius, and prepare, this is only the beginning. In the terrifying silence before a Roman siege, there was a machine, a beast of wood, rope, and iron, waiting to scream. The onager, a type of Roman catapult, wasn't just built to break walls. It was tuned, quite deliberately, to shriek. When fired, the torsion power released through twisted ropes would emit a sharp, unnatural whistle, high-pitched, unnatural, like the cry of something not entirely human. To defenders behind walls, that sound became a countdown to chaos. It gave no comfort, no rhythm to predict, just fear. Every shot could be your last moment. But the noise of the onager was one of the few sounds Roman engineers allowed. Much of their brilliance happened in silence, under moonlight, when the enemy was asleep, or trying to be. Roman legions didn't always arrive with siege towers rolling. Sometimes they arrived as ghosts. During the night, teams of engineers worked in absolute quiet, building fortifications just out of reach. Ditches, walls, ramps. Entire siege camps would appear overnight, like summoned fortresses. One day the defenders might see open fields. The next, a solid wall stood there, bristling with spears and watchfires. It was not only a physical shock, it was a psychological one. The enemy was surrounded before they even heard a hammer fall. Rome's message was clear: you sleep and we build your defeat. But some of Rome's deadliest work was invisible, buried beneath the earth. Skilled sappers, combat engineers trained in underground warfare, dug tunnels not only to sneak into cities, but to collapse them. These men would dig below the walls and supports of enemy towers, carefully removing earth and placing timber props in their place. Then, at the right moment, they would set fire to the wooden beams and retreat. What followed was sudden, thunderous ruin. Whole towers would crumble without warning, taking archers and defenses with them in one awful moment. The enemy never saw it coming until it was too late. Rome didn't rely solely on stone and steel. Fire was a favored weapon, especially when confusion was the goal. One of their most feared inventions during sieges was the flamethrower cart. These rolling devices were rigged to hurl burning tar or oil at enemy positions. When the tar ignited, it stuck to skin, shields, and wood, setting both defenders and their cover ablaze. The carts were sometimes pushed forward on wheels or hidden inside siege towers. When unleashed, the result was chaos, panicked troops, smoke-filled air, and lines broken in fear. It wasn't just the fire that killed, it was the uncertainty. No one knew when the next blast would come or where. To make sure these complex attacks worked in perfect harmony, Roman siege commanders used an ancient but highly effective form of communication: smoke signals. Each puff, column, or burst of smoke meant something specific. A single curl could mean advance. A broad cloud could signal archers to release. These weren't improvised gestures, they were coded systems that legions drilled long before the battle began. In vast fields where shouting was useless and messengers might die en route, these signals allowed Roman commanders to control armies with eerie precision. An entire siege line could shift, attack, or retreat in sync without a word spoken. This was Roman warfare in its most terrifying form. Not loud, not wild, but controlled, methodical, and silent until it needed to scream. Where other armies relied on numbers or brute strength, Rome relied on engineering, coordination, and fear. Their machines did not just break walls, they broke minds. In the Roman war machine, loyalty wasn't just expected, it was enforced through terror and rewarded with gruesome spectacle. Fear and honor went hand in hand, stitched together with blood and bone. Cowardice was not merely punished, it was displayed. If a Roman soldier abandoned his post or was caught retreating without order, the penalty could be far more than death. His severed hand, symbol of the grip he let go, the sword he dropped, was nailed to the camp's main gate or nailed to trees along military roads. It wasn't just a warning, it was a message to every soldier who walked past. Your body is not yours if you betray Rome. That hand, lifeless and shriveled, became a silent overseer of discipline. But horror wasn't only used to punish the weak, it was used to encourage the savage. Roman generals often gave extra rewards to soldiers whose kills were more than routine. If an enemy's body was mangled, head split, limbs crushed, or features unrecognizable, it was seen as a mark of dominance. These corpses weren't treated as fallen enemies, they were trophies. A soldier who returned with a blood-soaked sword and tales of violent conquest might receive a larger share of loot or even public praise from his commanding officer. The message was clear: brutality wasn't a crime, it was a currency. Sometimes the spoils of war included more than gold or slaves. They included bone. After especially bloody victories, it wasn't uncommon for returning Roman legions to march into cities with the skulls of their enemies impaled on spears, raised high like banners. These parades weren't impromptu, they were choreographed displays of supremacy. Skulls rattled in rhythm with the drums of victory, their hollow sockets staring into crowds that cheered not just for survival, but for absolute annihilation of the foe. These skulls weren't just symbols of death, they were advertisements for Roman power. To the crowds, they meant glory. To Rome's enemies, they meant extinction. In the strange logic of Roman war, even death had a rank. A soldier who died while showing extraordinary courage could be promoted after death. Post-mortem promotions were more than honorary gestures, they were emotional tools. The fallen might be named centurion or tribune, titles that would have given them command if they had lived. Their names were recorded as officers in death rolls. Sometimes they were buried with symbols of a rank they never lived to wear. Living soldiers looked on and saw not only the cost of valor, but its reward. Even the grave couldn't strip them of honor. Some of these dead, now outranking the very men who marched beside them, became legends whose names were spoken with awe in future campaigns. But just as Rome raised its heroes, it crushed its traitors with a unique cruelty. Among the ranks, theft, especially from fellow soldiers or from the spoils meant to be shared, was seen as a dangerous betrayal. It fractured the trust on which armies depended. So, to root it out, commanders devised a grim system: the death lottery. When a theft couldn't be pinned to a single man, but was known to come from within a unit, lots were drawn among the suspected. The one chosen by fate would be publicly executed in front of the entire legion. This wasn't justice in the modern sense, it was sacrifice for the sake of unity. And it worked. Few dared to risk death not for a crime they committed, but one that might be randomly assigned to them. It bred a kind of collective vigilance where every man watched every other, not just for honor, but for survival. In Rome's legions, loyalty was kept not with promises, but with blood. The Roman war machine wasn't limited to swords, shields, or formations. It extended into the land itself. Terrain was not merely crossed or conquered, it was manipulated, engineered, and weaponized. The Romans understood that the landscape could be made to fight for them, and they turned nature into a silent ally. Around enemy encampments, Roman forces created deadly fire rings. These weren't random wildfires, they were carefully placed zones of controlled burning. The goal was to trap enemy forces by encircling their camps with flames, destroying crops, and cutting off all avenues of retreat or resupply. A ring of smoke and fire left enemies not only starving and disoriented, but psychologically broken, knowing that escape meant death and surrender meant chains. Victory didn't mean mercy. When rebellions were crushed, Rome made sure they stayed buried. Entire fields were salted, not just literally with salt, but poisoned with materials that ensured nothing would grow for years. This wasn't just to punish the living, it was to erase the future. A land without food was a land without power. Farmers would abandon poisoned ground, populations would migrate or starve, and the very idea of resistance would decay along with the earth. It was a war tactic that turned soil into a grave, a slow death for any culture that dared challenge Roman control. In some cases, rivers became weapons. Roman engineers, trained as both builders and destroyers, diverted waterways to flood towns. This wasn't natural flooding, it was deliberate, controlled destruction. Entire communities were swept away by surging waters, redirected with canals and barriers. Riverbanks collapsed, bridges washed out, and defensive walls were undermined from below. Unlike fire or sword, which came with the clamor of battle, this kind of attack was quiet and merciless. Victims often drowned in their homes or were left scrambling for high ground as their foundations crumbled beneath them. It sent a clear message. Even the rivers could be bent to Rome's will. Forests, too, were transformed into death traps. Roman scouts and engineers studied the trees around conflict zones and selected them carefully. In ambush areas, they would cut and shape tree trunks in a way that left them weakened but still standing. These manipulated trees were rigged to fall with the right pressure or signal, collapsing like giant traps upon advancing enemies. A single shouted order could trigger the fall of dozens of tons of timber, crushing soldiers and creating panic in the ranks. These weren't random acts of destruction, they were timed and designed with surgical precision. In moments, peaceful woods became execution grounds. Perhaps the most haunting of Roman terrain tactics involved cities themselves. Sometimes Rome would abandon a town on purpose and turn it into a baited trap. These towns appeared deserted, with food stores, armories, and even open gates that lured desperate enemies inside. But hidden within the walls were traps, rigged ceilings ready to collapse, hidden fire pits, tripwires connected to blades, and soldiers waiting silently in dark rooms. The invaders, thinking they had stumbled upon a prize, found only chaos and death. Buildings became weapons, and the architecture itself turned on them. These bait cities weren't just strategic, they were psychological weapons, sowing fear and suspicion into every seemingly empty structure an enemy might encounter. In the Roman worldview, war was not confined to the battlefield. The very ground an enemy walked on could be turned against them. Through planning, engineering, and ruthless creativity, the Romans made the earth itself an extension of their military will. After the battle ended and the bodies stopped falling, Rome's war did not truly end. The real domination began in the silence that followed, the silence carefully designed to speak volumes. Along the great Roman roads, the ones that stretched like veins across the empire, crucified bodies were left hanging in the open. These were not hidden executions. They were public, methodical, and meant to be witnessed. Dozens, sometimes hundreds of corpses lined the highways, rotting slowly under the sun, a warning etched into flesh. The stench, the birds circling overhead, the hollow eyes of the dead, every traveler passing through would carry that memory. It wasn't just punishment, it was performance. The Romans knew that horror, repeated and made visible, planted seeds of obedience deeper than any speech could. In the newly captured cities, the sound of conquest didn't die down when the last sword was sheathed. Roman military bands marched through the streets, playing loud, triumphant tunes that echoed through alleys and temples. These were not random notes. They were songs of war, composed to remind every listener of who had won. These melodies drilled into the minds of the defeated, attaching the memory of loss to every beat and brass note. The sound of Rome's victory became inescapable. Even in their own homes, conquered people heard the music of their humiliation day after day until they stopped resisting and started remembering. Rome also understood the power of night. They passed laws forcing the enemy survivors to bury their dead under curfew, in silence, after dark. This wasn't just logistical, it was symbolic. Burying your loved ones in shame and darkness stripped away the last shred of dignity. No songs, no ceremonies, no public mourning. The enemy was made to walk through the bloodied streets at night, shoveling earth over bodies by torchlight, while Roman guards watched. It turned grief into punishment. Rome's enemies couldn't even grieve freely. Their sorrow became state-controlled, a tool of further conquest. The mind, like a wall, could be torn down, and Rome had tools for that too. In one of its most chilling psychological tactics, the empire practiced damnatio memoriae, the erasure of a person's name from history itself. Kings who defied Rome and lost were not only killed, but stripped from memory. Their statues were pulled down. Their names were carved out of stone inscriptions. Even coins bearing their faces were recalled or defaced. It was not enough to kill a man's body. Rome aimed to kill his legacy. No child would speak his name, no historian would record his deeds. He would vanish as if he had never lived at all. And in this vanishing, Rome asserted that it could even conquer time. Fire, too, played a role, not just as a weapon, but as a message. When Rome burned enemy cities, it sometimes used scented oils and herbs in the flames. This wasn't for beauty or mercy. The fragrance was symbolic. As temples, palaces, and homes burned, the air would fill with unfamiliar but purposeful smells. To the Romans, this was a purification, a ritualistic offering to their gods, signaling that the land had been cleansed of rebellion and impurity. To the conquered, it was a final insult, their destruction not only orchestrated, but perfumed. The smoke became a scent of submission, wafting across the ruins like incense at a funeral. It reminded both the victors and the survivors that Rome's domination was not just physical. It was spiritual. It was total. In the brutal theater of Roman warfare, fire and flesh were not just tools of destruction, they were twisted into instruments of terror. The Romans, masters of strategy, turned every element into a weapon, even in the cramped chaos of street combat. One of their deadliest innovations was the use of mobile cauldrons filled with boiling oil, mounted on carts with wheels. These were not mere props, but rolling death machines, pushed through narrow alleyways during urban battles. As enemy soldiers crowded to fight or retreat, the carts were tipped forward, releasing cascades of scalding liquid that clung to flesh and armor alike. The oil didn't just burn. It cooked, seeping into wounds and igniting panic. There was no armor thick enough, no reflex fast enough to stop the wave of agony. The psychological effect was just as deadly. The screeches of the burned echoed louder than war cries, shattering morale and leaving behind scorched, screaming reminders of Rome's merciless efficiency. But Rome's cruelty extended far beyond the streets. When surrounding enemy cities during long sieges, Roman engineers weaponized the dead themselves. Corpses infected with plague or other contagious diseases were catapulted over city walls, not just to insult, but to infect. These decaying bodies, swollen with sickness, exploded upon landing, contaminating water supplies, food stores, and even the air. The people inside, already hungry and desperate, began to fall ill, not knowing if it came from their neighbor or the air they breathed. Fear of invisible enemies, germs, and disease spread faster than the actual illness. Rome didn't need to breach the walls immediately. They let the sickness soften the city first, killing not with swords, but with breath. The air itself was turned into a battlefield. Roman soldiers loaded slingshots with specially prepared rocks coated in sulfur and pitch. These stones were lit on fire just before launching, so by the time they flew through the sky and hit the enemy line, they exploded in bursts of flame and choking smoke. These sulfur bombs didn't just burn skin, they filled lungs with foul, suffocating fumes that made it hard to breathe, let alone fight. In the middle of battle, this sudden fog of heat and poison caused confusion, blindness, and raw terror. Enemies scattered, disoriented by the attack, unable to tell which direction safety lay. Rome used this chaos to strike hard and fast, often breaking enemy formations before the first sword even touched steel. Even animals were not spared from the Romans' imagination. Wild dogs were captured, starved, and sometimes deliberately infected with rabies. These frothing, half-mad creatures were released into enemy camps at night when fear ran highest. They attacked indiscriminately, biting soldiers, howling into the dark, and turning sleeping quarters into dens of terror. Soldiers woke not to bugles, but to the sound of screaming comrades and tearing flesh. Once bitten, many men became sick themselves, their minds breaking before their bodies. In this way, Rome spread panic without lifting a single spear, letting nature do their cruelty for them. Deception was the final layer of this biological warfare. In moments of false generosity, Romans sent captured armor or weapons back to enemy leaders as supposed peace offerings or signs of respect. What looked like trophies of war were laced with toxins, poisonous substances rubbed into the leather, metal, or even decorative wrappings. When enemy commanders wore these gifts or passed them on to their men, the poison worked slowly but fatally, often mimicking illness or fever. The deaths were seen as mysterious at first, but by the time anyone suspected treachery, the damage had been done. Rome didn't just conquer bodies, they corrupted trust itself. Even the act of receiving a gift became a deadly gamble under their shadow. In the art of war, the Romans believed that perception could be as powerful as the sword. They perfected the use of illusion to control not just the battlefield, but the enemy's mind. One of their most cunning strategies involved retreating across bridges that were deliberately weakened or rigged. These wooden bridges were built with collapsible segments near the center, carefully engineered to support Roman troops during their retreat, but fail under the weight of a pursuing enemy. When the enemy, flushed with the thrill of victory, charged across in pursuit, the bridge gave way. Soldiers fell in screaming waves into the water below, many drowned under the weight of their own armor, some impaled by debris, and all caught in a trap they thought was a chance to win. The Romans didn't just retreat, they led their foes to destruction with a lie of weakness. But Rome's tricks extended beyond engineering. On open ground, they used the terrain as a canvas for lethal deception. Death pits, trenches dug deep and lined with sharpened stakes, were masked with thin layers of soil, leaves, and branches, made to blend perfectly into the earth. These were not wide holes, but narrow and deadly, placed precisely where enemy cavalry were most likely to charge. As horsemen rode in formation, driven by momentum and confidence, their mounts suddenly vanished beneath them into the hidden traps. The screams of both men and beasts were muffled by the snapping of bones and the sudden stop of movement. Entire cavalry waves were broken, not by arrows or blades, but by the ground itself turning against them. When night fell, Roman illusions only became more haunting. To create the appearance of massive armies where only a few stood, they manipulated fire. Torches were spaced far apart, then slowly moved across hillsides and ridgelines by small groups of soldiers. From a distance, it seemed like endless lines of troops were on the march, their flickering lights dancing like the breath of giants. The enemy, seeing what appeared to be overwhelming numbers, often froze in place or turned back, believing they faced a force far larger than reality. The trick was not just in the flames, but in the fear they fed. An army that feared ghosts would hesitate, and hesitation was all Rome needed to dominate without lifting a sword. Inside cities, Rome's deceptions grew even more personal. One of their most effective tactics was to send in fake defectors, soldiers or slaves pretending to have turned against Rome. These men offered information or cried out for shelter, claiming mistreatment and hatred for the Roman cause. Trusted by desperate defenders, they were welcomed through the gates, given food, and allowed to move freely. But once inside, they signaled to hidden Roman forces waiting nearby, or they crept to the city gates at night, unlocking them and letting the true army flood in. The fall of a city began not with siege towers, but with a smile and a lie, crafted so carefully that even the most cautious ruler was deceived. On the battlefield, the Romans even used surrender as a weapon. Entire units dropped their weapons, raised their hands, and walked slowly toward the enemy as if begging for mercy. They were allowed to approach, sometimes embraced, sometimes mocked. Then, at close range, these surrendering soldiers drew daggers hidden in their garments and lunged for the enemy commanders, often killing them before guards could react. The chaos that followed, leaders dead, trust shattered, tore through enemy ranks like wildfire. Rome didn't just win with numbers or steel, it won by twisting truth into a weapon, proving that the mind, when sharpened by deception, could cut deeper than any blade. In the Roman world, war was not just a matter of strategy and steel, it was woven into the fabric of their religious life. Violence was wrapped in sacred meaning, and terror was often disguised as divine will. One of the most powerful tools used to drive soldiers into battle was the ritual of priestly possession. Before combat, Roman priests, often dressed in flowing robes marked with sacred symbols, would enter deep trances in front of the assembled troops. Their bodies would shake, their voices would change, and their eyes would roll back as if something beyond the human realm had entered them. These priests claimed they were channeling the voices of the gods, especially Mars, the god of war. As they screamed out words of divine fury, the soldiers around them were swept up in a frenzy. Many began to howl, beat their shields, and shout cries to the heavens. This was not simply a ceremony, it was a carefully designed ritual to strip away fear and replace it with sacred rage. In those moments, the soldiers believed they were no longer fighting as men, but as vessels of the god's wrath. Their blades, they thought, were guided by divine hands. Just before an invasion, Roman commanders ordered the ritual killing of pure white animals, usually bulls, before the legions. These creatures were selected with care, chosen for their rarity and symbolic meaning. In Roman belief, white represented spiritual purity, and the bull symbolized unstoppable force. When their throats were slit and their blood poured onto the ground, it was believed that the gods were being fed a worthy offering. This ritual was not hidden or done in private. It happened in front of the army, often in the early morning, with soldiers watching in silence. As the blood steamed on the cold earth, the priests would proclaim that the gods had accepted the offering and that victory was now promised. This moment bound the coming violence to divine approval. To spill enemy blood was no longer an act of war. It was obedience to the gods. Soldiers marched forward with the sense that heaven itself had sanctioned their cause. Once Roman forces seized a new region, they moved quickly to show that their gods now ruled over the land. Sometimes within a single night, they would construct a small temple dedicated to a Roman deity, often Mars or Jupiter. These were not grand cathedrals, but swift, symbolic structures built with purpose. Their sudden appearance told the conquered people, "Your gods have been replaced." The temple was more than stone and wood. It was a flag planted in the spiritual soil. It stood as a visible marker of who now held not just political power, but divine favor. Roman soldiers would gather around these war temples to offer thanks, pray for future victories, and remind themselves that their conquest had holy approval. After crushing rebellions or uprisings, Rome staged executions that felt less like punishments and more like grim religious events. Captured leaders were paraded in chains, not simply to shame them, but to prepare them as offerings. These deaths happened in public squares, surrounded by watching crowds and chanting priests. The executioner sometimes acted like a priest, raising his weapon like a sacred blade before delivering the final blow. The idea was that the gods required payment for any resistance to Roman rule, and the blood of rebels was that payment. Citizens watched these acts with a mixture of fear and awe. The message was clear. Rebellion wasn't just a crime against the emperor, it was sin against the divine. To seal this spiritual domination, Rome also defiled the sacred places of the conquered. One of their most symbolic acts was inverting the altars of defeated gods. In some cases, the entire altar structure was physically flipped over, stones turned upside down, as if to bury the power of the former deity beneath the earth. This was not random vandalism, it was a statement carved in stone. It said the enemy's gods had not only lost, but been humiliated. These inverted altars stood as eternal reminders that Rome's gods reigned supreme and that divine terror had triumphed. The Roman legions were not just disciplined soldiers, they were engineered extensions of warfare itself. Their bodies became tools of both psychological and physical domination. One of the most subtle but effective tactics was staggered breathing. Soldiers trained to exhale together during charges or combat engagements didn't just create rhythm, they created fear. The unified force of breath sounded like a growl, an inhuman roar from an army that moved like one body. To enemies, it was as if the earth itself were exhaling death. This eerie, collective noise broke the confidence of opponents even before swords clashed. It wasn't merely sound, it was controlled terror. But Roman tactics were never about just one layer of fear. The body of the soldier was turned into a flexible arsenal. Consider their shin greaves. What looked like simple leg protection was far more. On the battlefield, especially in close, chaotic quarters, Roman soldiers sometimes wore greaves with sharpened blade tips embedded subtly into their structure. These weren't obvious weapons, but hidden edges that could strike during a knee jab or even when grappling on the ground. In a scrum, when the enemy grabbed at your arms or shoulders, the Roman might drive a shin into their thigh or side, cutting deep before the enemy even realized what hit them. Their legs became silent blades, hidden until blood proved otherwise. The shields, massive and curved, were already defensive masterpieces, but some legions enhanced them further by embedding spikes into the front. These weren't just ornaments, they were instruments of control. When facing riots, mobs, or dense enemy formations, these spiked shields acted like battering rams. They didn't just push, they punctured, tore, and shattered the front lines of any who stood in their way. A wall of soldiers pressing forward, each with a shield like a grinding wheel, didn't just displace enemies, it mutilated them. The spike wasn't for show, it was for supremacy in close quarters where brute force wasn't enough without brutality. The innovation didn't stop with weapons, it extended to awareness. Elite units, often stationed at vulnerable or strategic positions, wore bronze helmets with reflective surfaces or slight backward curvatures. These acted like early mirrors. They allowed the soldier to monitor movement behind him without turning around. In a formation where breaking ranks could lead to death, being able to detect motion at your back meant survival. You could spot an incoming blow, a retreating ally, or an approaching threat with just a glance at your own helmet's edge. It wasn't just armor, it was intelligence built into the body's gear. And perhaps the most visually impressive tactic was the use of kneeling rows of soldiers forming instant barricades. These were not desperate last stands, but deliberate, trained movements. When commanded, a line of legionaries would drop to one knee, shields raised forward and up, locking tight together. Behind them, more rows braced or used the backs of these kneeling soldiers as firing platforms or stepping surfaces. It created a living fortress in moments. Arrows glanced off the angled shields, cavalry charges broke like waves against them, and advancing foot soldiers slammed into an unmovable wall. These weren't just men kneeling, they were stone turned flesh, a mobile rampart shaped from human will. Each body was positioned not randomly but purposefully to become part of a larger structure, one that could move, fight, and hold under pressure. The Roman soldier's body was not just his own, it belonged to the legion, shaped and sharpened into a weapon, a tool, a wall, or a trap. The legacy of Rome did not vanish with its emperors or crumble with its marble statues. Instead, it seeped quietly into the bones of modern warfare, reshaping the way power moves, strikes, and remembers itself. The Roman eagle, once raised above legions marching into foreign lands, still finds its place in modern military insignia. The letters S, P, Q, R, Senatus, Populusque Romanus, meaning the Senate and people of Rome, once carved into stone and carried into battle, are now echoed in symbols worn by elite regiments around the world. These aren't mere decorations, they are whispers of Rome's cold confidence, carried forward by those who want their enemies to know. We belong to something ancient, something merciless, something that remembers how to conquer. In the tight alleys of today's urban warfare, Roman tactics breathe through concrete and dust. Modern soldiers, when clearing buildings or moving through narrow streets, often rely on compact, shielded formations, methods perfected by the legions during brutal campaigns in dense towns like Jerusalem or Carthage. Roman fighters were trained to move together in tight, disciplined packs, turning chaos into control. One man covered the left, another the right, and each knew exactly where to move next. That kind of instinct doesn't die. It survives in today's special forces, who still understand that victory in tight quarters comes not from wild violence, but from practiced unity. Even the mind games of war trace back to Roman hands. Today, entire sections of military doctrine are devoted to breaking enemy morale, spreading fear, confusion, or hopelessness. These tactics were not invented in the 20th century. The Romans mastered them. They staged fake retreats, ambushed supply lines, and spread rumors to make enemy leaders doubt their own soldiers. Their manuals and scrolls may have faded, but their ideas remain in modern psychological warfare. Soldiers are still taught that a broken spirit is more dangerous than a broken sword, and that terror, used well, is a weapon more powerful than any blade. Ritualized execution, too, found its cruel legacy in centuries that followed. Rome didn't just kill, it performed. Crucifixions were public, slow, and designed to scare the soul out of those watching. Beheadings in the Forum weren't just punishment, they were theater. This brutal choreography was adopted by medieval kingdoms and later by fascist regimes who understood the dark genius of public horror. When people watch suffering in daylight, fear takes root in silence. The Nazis, Mussolini's Italy, and even colonial empires borrowed from this Roman playbook. A punishment, done right, wasn't just justice, it was a message. Even the way soldiers walk today echoes the rhythm of Roman discipline. March drills in modern armies, with their synchronized steps and shouted cadence, are direct descendants of Roman marching culture. A Roman legion didn't just walk, it moved like one creature. Feet struck the ground in unison. Helmets and armor clanged in a terrifying harmony. This wasn't just for speed, it was psychological. It showed order, strength, and readiness. Today, when platoons drill with perfect timing, they are performing a ritual over 2,000 years old. Each beat of their boots is the echo of legions who once marched across continents, leaving roads, ruins, and fear behind them. Rome taught the world that power is not just about force, it is about memory. And when soldiers move in step, carry ancient symbols, or speak in commanding rhythm, they are not just following orders, they are continuing the empire's shadow.